Welcome back to Real Roots Radio. I'm really excited to have writer Scott Shea joining us on the program today. How you doing, Scott?
Hey man, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thank you. I was so intrigued with your article for the Strange Brew music site. It's based out of the UK, correct?
Yeah, strange brew kills what's inside of you.
There you go. Hey, well, I don't care what it is. If it's got something about Waylon Jennings on it, I'm really intrigued. And it's about the turning point in Waylon Jennings' career that you have isolated to this specific week in 1973. Very well researched and well written article. But what is so important about this week in January of 1973 that kind of changed the course and the career of Waylon Jennings and country music in general, if we're being honest?
Well, it's funny because Waylon went through a lot of changes in his career up until the point where he became an international superstar, really. But this was really the final change. This was the change where he went from, you know, average kind of run of the mill country singer, hit maker who, occasionally have a top 10 hit. He had a pretty good run there in the 60s into Waylon Jennings, the outlaw. And that's what everybody knows. So, Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, and This Time, and Lukenbach, Texas, and all those songs that we know about him. But he had been around for quite some time. I always say it took about Waylon about 15 years to become an overnight sensation because, as a lot of people may know, he started with Buddy Holly, played with Buddy on that fateful winter dance party tour that took his life in February 3rd, 1959. And then after that, he survived that. Was supposed to give a seat up to the Big Bopper, but he, out of an act of kindness, he gave it to the Big Bopper because he was under the weather, and went through a lot of iterations in his career from then. But 1973, this week, he played Max's Kansas City at the urging of his brand new manager, Neil Reshin. And he brought with him this attitude, this outlaw, kick ass Southern attitude that I'm here to play country music. And I'm sure it came out of his 15 years of frustration. And if you don't like it, you can go to hell. I know we're on radio. You can go to Hades, whatever. And if you don't, because here he is in front of this belligerent New York crowd in Greenwich Village. It was the place where Andy Warhol and all these artists hung out. It was the home of the glam rock movement, which it would eventually morph into punk. And so it's a young, hostile crowd who never even heard of this guy. And here he comes out. He's in his gosh, he's probably pushing 40 at this point. No, he's probably about 35. So he's about 35, 36, which probably seemed old to a lot of the people in attendance. And he just comes out with this belligerent attitude and then just kills them with this brand new, real outlaw style country music, very four on the floor, very thumping, very throbbing kind of rhythm based country music, really devoid of steel guitar, even though he did have, I believe Ralph Mooney was in his band at that time. So he didn't incorporate it into his live set, but he didn't really incorporate it into his records, and really no fiddles. It was basically a rock and roll band that played country music. And Waylon Jennings, the Outlaw, was born, in my opinion, on this week back in 1973.
And you say this week particular because he didn't just play one night at Max's Kansas City. He did a 6 night stay there, which, as you mentioned, for an audience that had no indoctrination on country music, that's a pretty unique get. And so that new manager of his really kind of pulled off a little bit of a coup, getting him to have a 6 night residency there.
It is, and Neil Reshin had managed for a short time the Velvet Underground, so I would imagine he knew the folks at Max's Kansas City and was able to get that lined up. And no Neil, I don't, the way Neil operated, I'm not sure how honest he was about the kind of music he sang, but it did work, and I think they were ready for that. And it's interesting because Max's Kansas City, and I couldn't find anything to back me up on this, but most artists who played Max's Kansas City back then did an early show and they did a late show. So it's most likely that Waylon probably did 12 shows there. He probably had an early set and a late set for 6 straight nights. I know that when he did leave, his voice was wrecked. He needed a little recuperation time before they flew out to Los Angeles to play the Troubadour. But I would imagine it was that probably added to the gruelingness of that particular stand.
You said this is in Greenwich Village. This is a different Greenwich Village conceptually than what is pictured in A Complete Unknown that I know a lot of folks just saw. It's very different than the Bob Dylan, Pete
Hmm.
Seeger, Greenwich Village. At that time, if an artist like a Doc Watson, who had kind of kind of had the back door into country music and would find
Yeah.
some major label success later. If he appeared in Greenwich Village during that era in the 60s, it really wouldn't have raised that many eyebrows. But to have this guy he'd put out what 16, 17 country albums on RCA,
Yeah.
show up. What about his take no prisoners attitude spoke to this new generation of Greenwich Village that had kind of moved on from the folk revival?
Well, yeah, I think it fit right in because, like I said, it was the home base of the glam movement, and not necessarily that, but the singer-songwriter genre. I mean, Bruce Springsteen had just really started playing at Max's Kansas City with the E Street Band at that point. Jackson Brown, a lot of players, David Bowie, probably I would imagine Bonnie Raitt. A lot of the people who played Greenwich Village in that time, who were kind of like a mixture of rock music and the former folk scene, which was now it was kind of in the rear view mirror, and like you say, it had changed. The folk boom really lasted until the mid 60s, and then rock and roll really started to kind of move in, and it was either sink or swim, and Greenwich Village adapted, and they started bringing in uh, former folk musicians with rock bands, or just any kind of rhythm section. So Waylon fit really right in, and if he had come in with maybe like a George Jones approach, where he's singing through his nose, and listen, I love George Jones, but George Jones is really for country music fans. He's not really going to sell too much in New York City, but at that time, there was just this whole change was just kind of under the surface in Nashville with not only Waylon, but Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson and even Hank Williams Jr. and a few other guys, Johnny Paycheck, David Allen Coe, that were
Bobby
really just
Bear, yeah.
yeah, that were really just kind of bubbling to the surface. If any of those guys played, they probably would have been welcome too. But really, Waylon was really just kind of the take no prisoners, just kind of he was the face of the outlaw movement because he just embodied the attitude. That's really why he's probably my favorite of all those guys, because of that, and just because he played just really great music, and he had such a unique sound that was really shaped really by his time with Buddy Holly and just time developing as an artist in Phoenix.
You you mentioned in the piece about how it was kind of a full circle moment for Waylon to be playing in Greenwich Village with this new brand of outlaw country music that he kind of helped architect. Why was it a full circle moment? You mentioned Buddy Holly. I know he kind of connects into that kind of coming up back around with Waylon, correct?
Well, yeah, because there was this great moment right before he took the stage, or as he took the stage, where somebody yelled out, "Who the hell are you?" Right? And he said, "I'm Waylon G.D. Jennings." And I'm sure that must have struck him because these kids probably were, in diapers back in 1959 when he had been there only for a few days. He stayed at the Brevoort, which is an apartment building just maybe a mile from miles southwest of where Max's Kansas City was, sleeping on Buddy Holly's couch, getting ready to go on this winter dance party tour in 1959 that Buddy had talked Waylon into joining. Actually, Buddy didn't even really talk him into it. He said, "Here's a bass. You're joining me," because Buddy's band, the Crickets, they were in a bit of he was in a bit of a feud with him at the time. He was fighting with his uh, boss, his manager at the time, and fighting for back money and royalties and Norman Petty was his name. And interestingly enough, the Crickets had kind of taken Norman's side. So Buddy had to go out on the road because his money was just kind of just hanging in limbo, and he couldn't even pay his rent. He had to borrow money from his wife's aunt to pay her the rent. So he went on this dance party tour, needed a band, and he got a couple guys he knew. He knew Waylon from working at KLLL in Lubbock, and they had also known each other back in the early '50s, playing different radio programs and stuff because Waylon had grown up in Littlefield, not too far away. And he got Tommy Allsup to play bass, Carl Bunch to play drums, and they went out as this kind of pseudo Crickets, and uh, went out on the dance party tour, played a few weeks, and then Everybody knows that story. Buddy gets on that plane. He got for the band to get a jump on the next tour venue because it was just a tough, cold tour of the Midwest. These guys were all freezing their butts off. A lot of them were from the South. They didn't experience this type of cold before. Minnesota, being in Wisconsin, Illinois, it's just a real tough sledding for if you're a snowbird, and unfortunately, Waylon, well, fortunately for Waylon, he backed out. He gave his seat to the Big Bopper, who wasn't feeling good. Tommy also gave his seat to Richie Valens, and about 5 minutes after takeoff, they crashed into a cornfield and they were killed. And just kind of sent Waylon into a depression. Took him a little while to get through, and then he had to just kind of start his career on his own because he was really Buddy Holly's protege at that point. Buddy was setting him up. He'd already recorded his first single with him that came out a month after Buddy died, and he was going to be his first big star on his new record label called Taupe, and just didn't happen, didn't come to be. So he had to start all over again. And Greenwich Village is really kind of where that all began.
So 15 years later, as you mentioned, he kind of became an overnight success.
Yeah.
Appropriate that Greenwich Village was the setting as well, because a lot of Waylon's early records had kind of been inaccurately dubbed folk country.
Yeah.
And of course, as Greenwich Village changed, Nashville was changing as well, and that kind of the tides were turning to an exciting new brand of music that we dubbed outlaw country now. That worked in Waylon's favor with a rock and roll background with Buddy Holly, and then with his own kind of interests and tastes as well. You mentioned that this stay in Greenwich Village in January of '73 was kind of the final piece of Waylon's kind of full transformation. What were some other things that had been changing for Waylon leading up to this moment?
Well, he had gotten a new manager and a guy named Neil Reshin. It's funny because when Waylon, he arrived on RCA in '65, he moved to Nashville in '66, put out at least a couple albums a year, but he never had a manager. He signed the deal on his own, and it was just a standard contract, a terrible royalty rate. And he was just, and he was meek, as strong as we know of Waylon. When he went into those studios, into the negotiations, he was meek. He didn't want to challenge Chet Atkins. He didn't want to challenge the studio musicians. He was the outsider. He came from Phoenix, and we know that Nashville at that time was not. They didn't welcome outsiders too much.
It was a machine.
It really was. It was a machine. They had it set up. They had the studio system. These guys were going to play on your records. This was going to be the arrangement, and you just shut up and sing, right? It wasn't like that for everybody, but it was, especially for the new artists coming in, it was like that. Willie Nelson went through the same thing. And so, we flash forward to 1972, and Waylon's health is bad. He's dealing with hepatitis B. He got from drinking water at plant. He was really popular among these Indian reservations in the Southwest, and he just drank the water there and got hepatitis and was really battling that. Not only that, but his career was just kind of in the doldrums. He was really struggling as far as getting hits, and he just didn't like the direction his music was going. He was just thinking about giving it all up and going back to Phoenix. And then Richie Albright, who was his drummer, who joined him back in '64, '65, and then he left for a little while, 3 years, and he had come back recently, and he saw the situation that Waylon was in. He saw what he looked like, and he said, "Listen, he's been a roadie. He had been a roadie for this band in Phoenix called Goose Creek Symphony. They were a Phoenix rock and roll band signed to Capitol. Nobody knew them, right? They didn't have any hits. You can look them up and hear the music, and it's fun and enjoyable, but it's nothing like super special." But Neil Reshin was their manager, and Neil had managed Miles Davis. Like I said, he'd managed Frank Zappa and Velvet Underground, and he was an accountant. He was a Jewish accountant from New York, no nonsense. From managing Miles Davis, he got his style of just artist comes first. The artist is the most important thing. The artist is more important than the record label. He's more important than the producer. He's more important than the president of the label. So when he brought in that kind of no nonsense negotiation for Waylon, and just really opened the door for the type of contracts we see, not only for rock and roll but for country music as well, where the artist, the old the rider like the rider, like only we want the M&Ms, would take out all the brown ones,
Yep, yep,
and
yep.
kind of like that's like Neil Resch, and he's like the guy who brought that, and there's other people too, but he's one of them. He brought that really to country music, and so it just really changed, and Waylon changed along with it. And I think, Waylon he'd always been, around his contemporaries, he'd always been just kind of a really cool cat, with a tough demeanor. But really, before Neil came along, he was really kind of meek when it came to negotiate. He was very passive and didn't want to deal with any of that stuff. He just took what was given him. His touring manager was ripping him off, even though he was a beloved guy, Lucky Muller, but and he managed Willie and a bunch of other guys too. But he had really made him an indentured servant. It's like you go on the road, I get 15% of your take. He didn't book him. He didn't book any venue that charged. He charged him $17.50 for his services for him and his band. They had to lug all their stuff back. So when Neil just took all that over and he just threw that all aside, and Waylon really took on that persona, and it really showed that night at that stand at Max's Kansas City.
It's interesting too that Neil was able to get some of these concessions, particularly in the recording contracts that you mentioned, because as you mentioned, Waylon at this time was still trying to find some consistency as a country artist. I know Bobby Bare was one of the first artists that was able to kind of regain creative control, but he had a little bit more clout at that time than Waylon
Mhm.
did. So it's a wonder that Neil kind of pulled that off on being able to get Waylon something that other established artists at the time weren't receiving, and that was creative control of their own records.
Well, I think one of the major reasons for that was the loss of Willie Nelson. RCA had lost Willie Nelson, and he had gone over to Atlantic, and he put out Shotgun Willie right around that time, and it was a smash. It wasn't the big hit. It wasn't like it is now, but it was among the Nashville people. It was like, wow, look what this guy can do. This is revolutionary, and he was starting to have hits and starting to build up, and they would point out to these. Neil would point out to the RCA people, you're going to lose Waylon just like you lost Willie. I mean, look at what Willie's doing. And I think that was fortuitous for Waylon, good timing there. And and Waylon, yeah, when you listen to his music, there's this period of like 69 to 71 where he's really kind of bogged down in the Nashville sound. I mean, there's good records in there for sure. There's good songs, but there's also like he did a great cover of Willie's song "Pretend I Never Happened" in
Mhm.
72, but it's like loaded with these background singers that just absolutely ruin the record. Like, I mean, like, and I'm not against background singers. I'm not against violins. I'm not against all these things, these accoutrements to make records sound better. But, it can be really overdone. It's like I remember hearing an interview with George Harrison when he talked about meeting Elvis Presley, and he's like, and this wasn't the Elvis that was singing in Las Vegas with all those squawking gals behind them. And it's kind of like that. It's like you had these squawking gals and guys, that were just kind of, overdoing it, and they just kind of overthought it too much. Danny Davis was producing him at the time, and he just loved throwing on the brass and the background singers and just overdoing it, just making it too saccharine. Like I said in the article, it's like there was the line between country music and adult contemporary were getting blurred. So when Waylon kind of got bogged down in that, but around the time of Good Hearted Woman, when he put that album, you could just really see it starting to grow. You could see he's finding his direction here. It took a little while, and it's evident. You go back to 65, 66, some of his first albums for RCA, you can hear it coming. And then Only Daddy That'll Walk the Line that came out in 68. That is outlaw country right there. When you listen to that, that's why he kept singing it live, because Willie would sing it live too. It's got the harmonica. It sounds like Mickey Raphael. I think Mickey Raphael was probably in high school when that album came out. Probably maybe in middle school. It's just got this great guitar solo. I interviewed for the book I'm writing about Waylon right now. I interviewed Charlie McCoy, and who was on that session, and he had talked about Waylon and the other guitarist who was on the session. I think his name was Wayne Moss. I'd have to look it up, but they had flipped a coin going into that session to see who was going to do the guitar solo, and Waylon won the toss. So that is Waylon. That is Waylon on the guitar in that session, and those guys, they sound as good as the Wailers, playing behind him on that record. But the funny thing was, he couldn't sustain that success. After that, he hit, that was his biggest chart single, hit #2 in '68, and then after that, he started to drop. Until maybe the early '70s. Even MacArthur Park, which he won a Grammy with, wasn't that big of a hit. I think it hit the top 25 or something in country. So, yeah, like the buildup that started around Good Hearted Woman really just flew into that Max's Kansas City gig at the perfect time.
This Max's Kansas City residency for about a week in January '73. 73 is also the year Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean was released. And I love that you point out it's the first album cover with the beard, which became so part of Waylon for the rest of his years, really. It became kind of part of his brand. So as you mentioned, kind of that full transformation. What about the week at Max's Kansas City in New York took Waylon from just a good country singer that seems to be having a little bit of a career reformation to the face of an entire movement in country?
Well, I think confidence for one, to see that he could pull something like that off. I'm sure it was a tremendous boon. Seeing the Waylon that I saw in interviews back in those days, he probably wouldn't let that show, but I'm sure that played a big part of it. And he followed that up with a good stand at the Troubadour and at the Palomino Club in Los Angeles. It was. I don't know if I would say that gig necessarily was the thing that started it. I think, after Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean, which is a great album, came Honky Tonk Heroes, which was later in the year, because Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean came out in March, and I think Honky Tonk Heroes came out in the fall. And it was an album mostly of Billy Joe Shaver, who really kind of forced himself on Waylon and threatened to beat him up if he didn't listen to his music in the studio, because he was hanging around the studio, Tom Paul Glazier's studios, Hillbilly Central, where that album was recorded, and it really got Waylon's attention, And when he finally said, and it's funny because he had recorded Black Rose back in '72. I think sessions for either Good Hearted Woman or Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean. So he had that in the can. So he knew how good a Billy Joe Shaver song was, And then when he started playing him all these other songs like Willie the Wandering Gypsy and Me, and so many. I think it's 10. I think it's 10 albums. So I think 8 or 9 album songs are Billy Joe Shavers. It just blew him away, and it's just the combination of those songs, his new sense of his new creative control, which he got now in his new contract thanks to Neil Reshin, and then having just kind of unfettered access to the studios at Hillbilly Central, which kind of went against union regulations. I think that was really what set into him being the face of the outlaw country music. And it's not like the movement, and it's not like hey, I'm going to start the outlaw country movement. It just happened, man. It was just all good timing, and with Willie having success with Atlantic and going down to Muscle Shoals and recording phases and stages. It was very fortuitous.
The album is the article is called Waylon Jennings Turning Point, January 1973. It's available now at The Strange Brew, great music blog. And Scott Shea, thank you so much for joining us here on Real Roots Radio today. Folks, go check out the piece. We'll put links on our social media. And where can folks go to learn more about you? I know you have a great book about the mamas and the papas out there for folks that are interested.
Right. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, it's called All the Leaves Are Brown, How the Mamas and Papas Came Together and Broke Apart. It's available from Backbeat Books. You can find it at any fine bookstore or online at Amazon or any place like that. You can go to my website, scottsheaauthor.com. Shea is spelled SHEA, and it'll give you links to where you can buy it, links to these articles and other things.
Now, Scott, you're going to have to keep us in the loop as you make progress on your new Waylon book, all right?
I will do that.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us on Real Roots Radio today.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.